So the closing plenary is titled Priorities and Solutions for a Global Biodiversity Finance Roadmap. So the idea here is to bring together experts to explore the key priorities and the most impactful solutions needed to meet the goals of the biodiversity framework. So we'll examine the roles of various stakeholders, including financial institutions, policymakers, driving the progress. So we're also going to have a voice from an Indigenous leader. So we also need to hear from these Indigenous leaders and understand their needs, practices, and perspectives on this roadmap so that we can build a very inclusive and just roadmap. So as we discuss the roadmap, we will also have an amazing artist. Her name is Anna Denardin, and she will draw the roadmap and the steps needed to achieve it properly in real time. So this is very exciting because we're going to have a physical representation of what we're talking about in this closing plenary. And then as you can see, this is the beginning of the roadmap. And at the end, we will see the roadmap sort of come to life. And all of the ideas that everyone's going to bring will be then represented visually. And I think it's going to be really exciting to see that at the end. So before we enter into the roadmap details, I would like to welcome our inspiring keynote speaker, the Honorable Sesa Pitangari, who is the Secretary of Indigenous Environmental and Territorial Management from the Ministry of Indigenous Peoples of the Government of Brazil. So she will speak to us on the role. Yes, please come to the stage. She will be speaking to us about the role of how can we make sure that finance goes to the front line, and how can we make sure that Indigenous voices are being heard. So please give her a round of applause as she enlightens us.
Boa noite, todos e todas. Prazer estar aqui nesse importante evento que busca traçar um mapa para o caminho da conservação da biodiversidade. Este caminho passa, primeiramente, por uma mudança de paradigmas. Passa por um modelo que parte da cosmovisão indígena de que ser humano e natureza estão conectados. Em várias línguas, isto ganhou o nome de Bem Viver, Tecoporã. Nesta COP, a Colômbia deu o nome deste novo modelo de paz com a natureza. Outro conceito importante é a integração dos temas de biodiversidade e mudança do clima. Não é possível mais pensar que biodiversidade e mudança do clima não estão conectadas. Percebemos o custo da não proteção quando vemos os impactos dos eventos extremos cada vez mais frequentes. No Brasil, este ano, vivenciamos chuvas excessivas e alagamentos da região sul do país e seca da região amazônica. Os impactos das mudanças do clima são mais graves onde a biodiversidade foi mais atingida, além de afetar com mais intensidade a vida das populações historicamente excluídas, evidenciando aquilo que chamamos de racismo ambiental. Por isto, é tão necessário falarmos também de transição justa, junto com a integração de biodiversidade e mudança do clima. No nosso Ministério, sou responsável pela Política Nacional de Gestão Ambiental e Territorial Indígena, uma política que constrói junto com cada povo indígena o seu plano de conservação e usufruto sustentável do território e da biodiversidade, e também em conjunto busca os meios de implementá-la. As melhores políticas são aquelas que partem da valorização do conhecimento tradicional. De fato, a biodiversidade das florestas, aparentemente intocadas, são, na verdade, resultado do cultivo milenar de povos e comunidades vivendo em harmonia com a terra em seus territórios. Não à toa, temos, após séculos de genocídios e tentativas de expulsão, as menores taxas de desmatamento no Brasil nas terras indígenas. Por isto, povos indígenas e comunidades locais precisam estar no centro do processo da COP, o que pode ser feito com o Grupo 8J se tornando um órgão subsidiário. Além da violência que sofrem, os povos indígenas conservam a biodiversidade com a menor parte do financiamento mundial. Como a ministra Sônia diz, os países desenvolvidos aportam apenas 1% do seu compromisso mundial e deste 1%, também 1% é o que chega na ponta dos nossos territórios. Então, recebemos 1% do 1%. O principal problema do financiamento ambiental internacional é o fato dos países centrais que reconheceram os princípios das responsabilidades comuns que devem ser diferenciadas não cumprirem seus compromissos de financiamento ambiental global, incluindo aí o financiamento para a conservação e o uso fruto sustentável da biodiversidade. Sabemos que existem setores no mundo, não só aqueles da extrema-direita, que querem seguir com o projeto de exploração e genocídios. Em todos os países megadiversos, isto é uma realidade. Portanto, não podemos ficar à mercê das políticas internas dos países megadiversos e historicamente dominantes. Precisamos do financiamento internacional para que as políticas de conservação sejam constantes. A PNGAT, dentre outras políticas, assim como as práticas tradicionais dos povos indígenas para a conservação e usufruto sustentável da biodiversidade, são, portanto, atividades internacionais e precisam de financiamento internacional para garantir sua estabilidade e perenidade. Por isto, o financiamento direto e a repartição efetiva dos benefícios com os povos explorados há séculos são ações importantes. Elas garantem o processo de reparação, de aumento dos recursos e de eficiência para a paz com a natureza. Permite que quem atua na ponta e tem projetos mais eficientes tenha acesso a recurso, reduz a burocracia e garante estabilidade internacional para uma política decisiva para o mundo. Muito obrigada a todos e todas.
Thank you so much, Ceisa. That was a lovely speech. Very important. So now as we move on, we can define the roadmap for biodiversity investments and explore the priorities and the key stakeholders needed to achieve the targets of the Global Biodiversity Framework. So now I would like to invite the panelists one by one on stage. First we have Supra Bhattacharjee, the Director of General for the Forest Stewardship Council, FSC. We also have Dr. Teofil Zognau, the CEO of Sangha Trinational Trust Fund and the President of the Consortium of African Funds for the Environment, CAFE. We also have Emil Siran Gwalinga, an Indigenous Rights and Climate and Biodiversity Finance Specialist and researcher for Business and Human Rights Resource Center. Fourth, we have Camila Silva Arango, the Technical Assistance Manager for Finance in Motion. And we have Heitor de Lasta, a Conservation and Climate Finance Specialist from Citaui Finance, an NGO from Brazil, and he's also the coordinator for Global Youth Biodiversity Network. Heitor? And last but not least, we have Emil Rabin Hirakushun, the Finance Thematic Lead of the Climate and Development Knowledge Network, South-South. So, panelists, are you ready to define the roadmap together? Heitor, I'm going to start with you, and I would really like for you to talk about what a comprehensive roadmap for financing biodiversity should focus on so that we ensure effective, inclusive, and impactful investments.
Hello. Yes, thank you. Hello, everyone. First of all, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for all sharing your time with us. I'm Heitor. I work in a Brazilian NGO, working with Positive Impact, and also policy co-coordinator for the Global Youth Biodiversity Network. So the past few weeks have been very embedded in the negotiations, and I'm always coming to these places and thinking about this process of the negotiation process and the implementation. So the roadmap is also thinking about how to fund the Global Biodiversity Framework. And the Global Biodiversity Framework really set us very ambitious goals and targets that are proposing for us a transformative change approach for us to really think about how can we achieve how to reverse biodiversity by 2030, but also achieve living in harmony with nature vision by 2050. And when you're thinking about the implementation perspective, policy, we are advancing, we have gaps, but we are on the board. But implementation, we are still failing it. And we need to start figuring out why we are failing when we are trying to figure out implementation for biodiversity finance. And first, it's really important to understand that nature have a diverse values perspective. And when we are talking about finance for nature, most of the times we are still strictly thinking about one of these approaches. We are still only thinking about the economic, the instrumental, and the financial perspective of nature. And this is part of our crisis, because we are living this values crisis that are bringing us to our biodiversity loss, our climate change, and increasing social inequalities and socio-ecological conflicts all over the world. And these are broken markets that we need to figure out. And now we have basically two, I would say, main concerns regarding how biodiversity finance are approaching nature, and of course how they are approaching also territories and communities that live in harmony with nature. First of all, is recognize this diversity of values of nature, which means that all over the world and for thousands of years, we have been shaping different relationships with nature, and we have communities, indigenous peoples, local communities, Afro-descendant people that are also shaping different ways on relationship with nature. Since from living by nature until living as nature, where we recognize a diverse perspective that we are embedded in a relationship with more harmonious way. And when we are not seeing this, it means that we are creating problems. And two main problems is one, the way that markets are approaching communities. And we are really seeing a lot that markets are approaching communities, they are going to consultative process, participatory process, but the question is, are they ready to listen a no? Are they ready to listen communities who say that they do not want the approach that they are bringing to them? Because now, most of the cases that we are seeing, we are still having the same worldview coming through communities and ask them to create scalability, to create replicability of their own projects. And what they should also ask is how to keep sustainable lifeways and truly consult there, make meaningful and full effective participation of this process, and be responsible for this action to receive. No, we do not want to work on this process that you are bringing to us. You need to start to change your mindset to be able to really create financial solutions for these communities. And the second thing is the financial instruments that we are building, that they are also not in dialogue with communities. And that's the problem, because they are not recognizing this diversity of nature itself. If you are trying to create financial instruments that are still only trying to figure out your own challenges, you're trying to figure out how to compensate your damage, you're trying to figure out how to compensate your impacts, you're not truly co-creating financial instruments with these communities. So we are now having huge problems regarding measurement about biodiversity. It's included because of this diversity of values. Nature is unique, nature is not tradable. And when we consider this diversity of relationships between natures, it's even more complex. We have secret places, we have relational places that are not changeable at all. And second, this is exactly creating these difficulties of counterfactual. You can't compare it. And if you can't compare it, you can't create just easily solutions. We are, at the end of the day, creating low integrity, we are creating broken markets that are not put on the track. So perfectly here, I think we're having listen solutions, and you will listen more solutions, but this is our first approach to understand that nature is diverse, and nature needs to be also considering this diversity if you want to start funding nature.
Thank you so much. So really having a bottom-up solution and listening to the communities is a fundamental component of the roadmap that we need to consider. So moving on, I would like to talk about now the importance of ecosystem services and the need for rewarding nature. So Supra, I'm going to now direct the question to you, is how can we effectively value biodiversity and ecosystem services and ensure that nature is getting rewarded properly and getting integrated into the national and global economic decision-making processes?
Is it working now? Yes. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, organizers, for bringing us together here. This is such a lovely setup, and Honorable Sesa, I so appreciate the speech you gave us, the keynote speech you gave us today. And colleagues, friends here, it's the end of the day. Appreciate your still making time and the attention you give us. So let me build on what my previous panelists said, the issue of rewarding or valuing ecosystem services. Just a few days back, I came across this quote on my LinkedIn feed of all places. Honeybees don't send an invoice. Maybe they should. Truth be told, there is so much out there, and my previous speaker referred to the diversity in nature. Not all of it is economic. Not all of it is even known and understood. So how do we put a value on it? For the roadmap, a key element would be what we call non-market valuation. Valuing those things, putting a dollar value on those things for which there is no market. Now, when I say the word dollar value, I know that will create immediate sense of resistance in some, because so many things cannot be reduced to dollars. But those are some hard conversations we have to have if we are going to value. When we value something, we need to put a number that is understood. Non-market valuation techniques are fairly well developed. They also include what we call existence value. As in, we want something to exist. What is my willingness to pay for something to exist? Not just to use, to exist. So non-market valuation, that's the first one. Now that we've put a dollar value, how do we actually make the dollars flow to make sure that those are preserved? So here, let me start with a number. Today I read that the biodiversity financing gap is $700 billion to 2030. So what does that mean? I have never seen $1 billion. I assume you haven't either. So in terms of scale, the climate finance goal that is widely accepted, not just now, but for the past several years, is $100 billion per year. Not in 1 year has that goal been met, and here we are talking about $700 billion, 7 times that amount. No government in the world has that much money, especially not those countries which are fostering the richest biodiversity in the world. Many of the countries in Africa are seriously debt-ridden. They cannot mobilize that amount. In other words, what I'm getting at is the private sector must be a source of a solution here. The way we have thought of private sector, the way we have engaged with private sector, that needs to change. And the private sector, not just the big companies, but down to the small holders, have to be part of the solution. At FSC, the Forest Stewardship Council, we believe in stewardship of forests, not exploitation. And we need to think of biodiversity to move away from exploitation to stewardship. And that is what we'll get, and that is the beginnings of valuing ecosystem and getting the dollars there. In the interest of time, I'm going to stop here, but happy to engage further.
No, what you said is totally on the mark, because I share very similar views about stewardship and the way that we should look at biodiversity credits from a stewardship lens rather than from a very metrics lens and trying to get this one-size-fits-all value. I don't believe that that's going to be very possible with biodiversity. So lots to unpack there. Lots to unpack there, and I really want to dive into what you're saying. But I'd like to switch over now to get some views from Africa. So Theophile, with your extensive work in African environmental funds, what mechanisms do you see as essential for ensuring long-term financing for biodiversity in the Global South?
Okay, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Normally I speak French, but I will try to say a few words in English. So I'm the CAFE president, and CAFE is a consortium of environmental fund in Africa, which is created since 2011, operating in 22 countries. And in terms of endowment fund, we have something like $600 million and 200 sinking fund. To target, to raise all that money, we implement almost all the mechanism: biodiversity offset, payment of ecosystem service, carbon fund, partnership with private sector. But do these mechanisms work well in Africa? Really not much. Why? We don't really know what are the criteria of the donors. If you compare what is going on in Africa and what is going on in Latin America or Asia, you will see that Africa is all the time at the last position. Why? So we start thinking about what to do. You said a few minutes ago that Africa may not raise sufficient money, but I say we can. I think what is important is the political will of our government. Last year in Arusha, we have a Congress, CAFE Congress in Arusha, and there we make a declaration calling our respective government to carry out reform, structural reform, and especially ecological fiscal reform. Can raise a lot of money. We have knowledge of that, but as I said, it's political will, not only technical. So if I take an example, Nigeria is almost 180 million inhabitants. If you count the number of bottles of beers and mineral water that are consumed each day, per day, in that country, let's take 80 million bottles of beer and mineral water. If you take, let's say, only 5 cents on each bottle, how much will we raise at the end of the day, after a year? We can. And that's what we are trying to do now in Africa, because we don't know what are the criteria of the donors. And even those, the donor says, okay, we are giving you, let's say, 1 million grant. There are a lot of intermediaries. You have international NGOs taking their management fee, staff costs, cost recovery. You have technical assistance. And at the end of the day, what do we have in the field? Why we are trying now to push our respective government to carry out those reforms, especially the ecological fiscal reform. I have knowledge about that. And I think, and we are convinced in CAFE that it's only that way we will enable Africa, not only to protect the biodiversity, but develop the country.
Thank you so much. I would like now to turn it to Emile and get your perspective on what your vision for, driving finance to biodiversity and what your view for the key components of this roadmap include from your perspective.
Thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Emile. I'm from the Quichua people of Sarayaku in Ecuador. I will talk a bit about my experience, about full and effective participation of indigenous peoples. I think Heitor over here already commented on the topic, but I will try to share some of my viewpoints. I think it's well known that we as indigenous peoples have faced colonialism, and our lands have been taken and keeping damaged. First we had the missionaries, and then we had the rubber tappers, and then we had the logging companies and extractives, oil companies, and so forth. But we have kept defending our lands, so that's why if you look at the indigenous territories, it's still the most conserved territories. But what we see now is often a new wave of colonialism by those new mechanisms, climate finance, biodiversity finance, and so on. Whether it's carbon credits or whether it's a conservation project, protected area, and so forth. Our lands are being dispossessed, or we lack oftentimes full and effective participation in decision making. So you probably heard the number that 1% of climate finance reaches indigenous peoples. I think this number is greatly exaggerated. It's much less than 1%, because if you look at the funding for indigenous land tenure security, only 17% of those projects mention an indigenous organization. So I think it seems out of this 1%, only 17 even talked with an indigenous organization. So out of this 17%, how much went to the indigenous people? I don't know the percentage, but I would guess a very low number as well. So I think this number is a lot lower than 1% and a lot lower probably than 0.1% as well. But what I think happens is there's a lot of money to be made by mentioning indigenous peoples in projects and so on, but then we're not in the participation in decision making. The projects are predetermined, and then they go to the indigenous people to get the validation. So I think this is what needs to change. We should have the full and effective participation in the decision making, in the government, in the financial institutions, whether it's a multilateral funding mechanism or private sector, and so forth. And so all the projects that happen on indigenous territories should have this first co-creation. We should work as equals with indigenous peoples, but not by imposing an agenda from the outside. So I think this direct access, which is what indigenous peoples have been advocating for a long time in CBD COP and other forums, I think that we need to make this happen also in the implementation part, as Heitor was also saying. Because now there's this aspirational number of 20%, but it seems even this will, a lot of things need to change. People need to change their mentalities. There needs to be reforms to actually put this into practice. And I think a lot of indigenous peoples are also frustrated about this. So some of my colleagues from Ecuador, from back home, they were saying, actually, you guys are not the donors, you guys, the funding mechanisms are not providing the finances to the territory. They were saying, we as indigenous peoples, we are the ones that are financing it without having financial resources. Thank you.
Thank you. So really, what I'm hearing is that we really need to focus on, bottom up, local, and integrating who's on the ground, who's on the front line, conserving, and understanding what their needs are. So really deep listening is what I think we need to be doing to create solutions that are not imposed on people, but that are created from the people, for the people. So this is all around sort of the second pillar, and it's really highlighting the importance of getting this, financing to the local level. So I'd like to transition over to you, Emil, to get your view on this discussion that we're having, and your ideas on what the enabling environments regarding policies, regulations, and partnerships that are needed to really drive this transformative action for biodiversity finance, especially at the local level.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much for the question. And what I specifically work on is on finance for resilience. So really looking at the intersection between biodiversity finance, climate finance, development finance, as well as then disaster risk reduction and humanitarian relief, including then the traditional financial sector and the role that private sector plays. So in my mind, I don't see these different streams of finance as being siloed, but of course we all know and hear and talk about quite often how siloed these conventions are and how siloed the finance is. So I don't want to spend too long talking about policy and regulatory reform. I think it's something we probably all hear very often, and actually we just want to see movement on this. But I will quickly address some of the aspects of policy and regulatory reform, and then how that could potentially lead to some of what Shubhra was talking about in terms of mobilizing private sector. So of course we need governments to put in place enabling policies and regulatory environments that promote or enable nature-positive economies. So at the national level, for example, policies and regulations that protect and restore, that reduce harm. At least one of the statistics I've heard around environmentally harmful subsidies, $2.6 trillion in 2024. We cannot start talking about mobilizing the $700 billion that Shubhra mentioned earlier without talking about reforming subsidies that we know harm the environment. To Shubhra's point as well around valuing nature, this is not about necessarily only economic and financial values, but as well as non-economic and non-monetary values. So we do need reform in that regard as well. We need reform in terms of finance, particularly how we articulate the long-term sustainable financing of synergistic biodiversity, climate, and development action. And we need this to be enshrined in terms of commitments in this regard. Talking about commitments, and just very quickly on this, nationally determined contributions, national adaptation plans, and NBSAPs. We need these to all be coordinated. We need these to articulate what contextualized national priorities are in this regard and how it relates to national development plans and national development priorities. Now, all of this is not to say that we want to overregulate, but rather create a transparent, robust, and fair policy and regulatory environment that sends a signal to private sector and other investors around the investment potential in climate change, biodiversity, and development. At the global level, very quickly as well, we have all of these different operating entities of the financial mechanisms. The Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, and the GEF, of course the GEF straddling the two conventions. What we need is a harmonization of their policies, procedures, and requirements for access that allow us to realize the potential for the complementarity of these different streams of finance. We really want to avoid fragmentation. And I work a lot with countries on how they access finance from these respective funds, and I work a lot with these funds. We created these policies and procedures and requirements as people, and we can change them to start realizing what our amazing keynote speaker was referring to earlier, the paradigm shift around how we see local communities, indigenous peoples, and the most climate affected. But let me leave it there. Thank you.
Well said. Thank you so much. So I want to keep on this private sector mobilization theme because it's sort of our third pillar, and I think it's where we really need to hone in because it's where a lot of the funding, I think, will come from, as we've been pointing out here from the panelists. So I want to transfer it over to Camila and get your perspectives on how we can mobilize private sector funding and what are the different incentives that we can offer to the private sector so that they, get integrated into biodiversity financing through blended finance or de-risking mechanisms, which I think is a really key component of integrating private sector investments.
Thank you, Hannah, and good afternoon to everyone. I would like to continue woven the fabric of the different messages that we have heard today from the different colleagues. I'll split my answer in two main areas. The first one, I will talk about blended finance and the risk and mechanisms. And on the second hand, I will speak a little bit about the different financial incentives that we can have in the market. So in order to incentivize the private sector, I believe that we need to address two main elements. On the first hand, we need to address the perceived risk. Normally, private actors perceive biodiversity-related topics or biodiversity-related projects as high risk. And on the second hand, we also need to address the uncertainty of the financial returns that are related to biodiversity projects, mainly in the early stages. So I think here is where blended finance plays a pivotal role by making biodiversity-related projects much more attractive and much more doable or viable. And what's exactly blended finance? I'm not sure if you are all familiar with that concept, but blended finance, it's basically a financial strategy where we have a different set of resources. So let's imagine a blender when we can have public donors, when we can also have philanthropic investment as well as the private sector. So all these different actors aim to finance or to fund different activities or projects in high impactful sectors and also in risky sectors. What I think is also very interesting of blended finance is that it has some specific de-risking mechanisms. I would like to mention 3 of them that could help us to encourage these private investors to get more into this type of financing. So the first mechanism is what we call first loss capital. And this works as a financial buffer or as a financial cushion where the public actors and the philanthropic actors absorb the first losses. The second, the risking mechanism, is what we call guarantees. So guarantees are mainly offered by third parties, such as development financial institutions or DFIs, or government entities. And the guarantees also give kind of a comfort to private actors, because in the worst case scenario, there is going to be a repayment of the loan or for the ticket, no? And lastly, the third, the risking mechanism, it's the insurance mechanism. So here we have a specific insurance to cover or to tackle some of the risks that are related to biodiversity. We can have here risks like political instability or currency fluctuations, as well as, let's think, natural disasters. So for example, in the agriculture sector, we can have an insurance that could help prevent losses or revenue losses from potential extreme weather events. No? So that's for blended finance and the risking mechanisms. And now, when we continue thinking on these innovative financial instruments, I would also like to bring to the scenario the 3 main financial instruments that we are seeing that are getting more and more traction in the market. The first one is thematic bonds. So thematic bonds is basically a debt instrument with a specific environment, social, or sustainable targets. We have seen the rise of green bonds that are the most well-known thematic bonds. But also we have seen how in the more recent years, there's also a rise of green bonds that are the bonds related to water ecosystem or marine conservation protection. And even now, we're also seeing how the biodiversity bonds are rising. So we have on the first hand thematic bonds. Then we can continue having another instrument that is biodiversity credits that work very similar as carbon credits. And lastly, but not less important, we also have impact investment funds or biodiversity focus funds. Here, maybe I can give an example of 2 impact investment funds that I represent under Finance in Motion. The first one is La Green, that's the first Latin American green bond fund dedicated to enable the financial ecosystem for thematic bonds. And on the second hand, we have Eco Business Fund. The Eco Business Fund has been launched 10 years ago in Latin America and the Caribbean, and also more recently in Sub-Saharan Africa. And it's a fund specifically for biodiversity conservation in the agriculture sector, in the aquaculture sector, as well as in the sustainable tourism sector. So wrapping up, I think that these innovative financial instruments paired with blended finance and de-risking mechanisms pose a giant opportunity to bridge the gap between the conservation goals and the private sector. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Camila. You brought a lot of real, tangible examples of different solutions for the private sector, so thank you so much. On the private sector note, I feel like, Subha, you have more to say. I'd like to pass it over to you just so we can sort of wrap up some of the ideas that you had about private sector and how we can mobilize these funds. If you'd like to share quickly, we're getting close to the end, so I'd like shorter responses in the second half, but please share with us.
So just to keep it short, let me build a little bit on two ideas that have come up, one from Camilla and I think one from the panelist, my friend to the right. So the two ideas here. First is de-risking, right? When it comes to de-risking and we are looking at these highly risky projects that are and in a situation of high ecological crisis and ongoing ecological crisis, stewardship and de-risking, risk mitigation through proper management of forests and biodiversity, through sustainable management of forests and biodiversity is a source of risk mitigation. What if we could think of ways to leverage that de-risking or risk mitigation mechanism and tie it to finance? Here I'm guessing. Say, when a smallholder commits to sustainable forest management, meets some really stringent criteria. Those stringent criteria have to do with environmental protection, with maintaining labor rights, rights of indigenous peoples, with a set of very strict, well-accepted criteria. And through certification, this is a long-term commitment. What if the commitment itself is the collateral? And banks can give loans or financial instruments can be devised to leverage that commitment as a collateral. Now, this is not an out-of-the-world or totally crazy thinking, because globally we have microfinance, which is a tried and tested model, which has leveraged social capital, social relationships as collateral. So there is precedence. In FSC, another possibility that I could talk about it, the Forest Stewardship Council, we have gone through a process of extensive risk assessment for some 60+ countries. These take into account human rights risk, environmental risk, political risk, a whole set of, again, very well-defined risks. And because we believe in sustainability, we've made it available for free to anyone. Financial institutions can make use of these, our risk assessments which are out there, together with deforestation, degradation risk. That's all features into the matrix. It's all very transparent, available. Use it and make credit or make finance available at lower rates, lowest possible rates to communities that need it the most. Before I just end, I have to hit on one point because this has come up so much in this panel today. You cannot protect biodiversity or forests without empowering the original forest stewards, who are the local communities and the indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples are at the heart of what Forest Stewardship Council does. They have a say in all our decisions that we make, and respect for the rights of the indigenous peoples as defined in the UN conventions is built into our principles and criteria. With that, I'll stop.
So with that, I'd like to segue back to Emil so that he can give some perspectives from the Indigenous peoples to ensure how they will benefit directly from biodiversity conservation and what mechanisms that can be used for fair access and benefit sharing. Emil, please share some more thoughts on how this all ties in.
So I want to reflect on the issue of the private sector and the profitability and scalability and so forth. What I've seen in Ecuador is that there's a few indigenous cooperatives that are engaged in commercial activities, mostly connected to transport, such as roads, or have access to bigger rivers. Most of the communities, including my own community, have no access to roads or don't have access to big rivers. So there is no profit to be made. We can't it's difficult to make a profitable business. So if we outsource the state's obligation to finance biodiversity to the private sector, then the financing will only go towards the activities that are profitable. And it's difficult for many communities to engage in profitable activities, including in my community. It's not part of our way of life or culture. We have a collective culture based on the community harmony and so on. So if all the families were just trying to engage in maximizing profitability, we would have to change our ways of life and make it more individualistic also. One example, a good example that we had in my region was this airplane company. So it's an indigenous-owned airline which works with indigenous peoples, but the problem was that the government doesn't provide the health. So, for example, if somebody gets bitten by a snake in the forest, there's no public service so that this person can go to the hospital. So even being a for-profit business, this airline had to subsidize the cost for the indigenous persons to evacuate them to the city. So this is also an example of the government neglect. So the government is actually neglecting most of the basic services to indigenous people, such as access to transport, access to communication, access to intercultural education. It's typically an imposed education system, intercultural health services, and so on. And one of the problems also is that some of so even then it was difficult for this business to be profitable because they had to subsidize all those costs. So it saved probably hundreds of lives. So I think we just need to be mindful of this government obligation and not try to outsource everything or just focus on ecosystem services that are profitable and so on, but there's other things that can't be valued in profit or monetary terms.
Thank you. Peter, I want to pass it over to you and get some more perspectives from the youth, because you lead the youth biodiversity. And yeah, it would be interesting to see what perspectives the youth need to bring to this roadmap.
Yes, thank you very much. And I think when we talk about youth, the main thing is consider that youth is a collective movement. And youth is not only a range that are included in certain age, but it's a collective movement that are working side by side and trying to really shape different socio-ecological realities. So if you go to CBD negotiations and outside of CBD negotiations, our youth movement are pushing for same flags and trying to create and co-create process alongside with indigenous peoples, local communities, and women. And this is one of the first things that we are bringing different values to the discussions. We are bringing different values to the table of the negotiations and also to the implementation process. These are values, as we have heard, intrinsic to recognize nature as it is, and also relational values, recognition the different ways that different people all over the world are relating with nature, considering care, considering justice, considering equity, and considering stewardship, as we also a lot heard. And this brings us perspectives about how to change it and how to create solutions when you're thinking about it. So one, we also heard, and that is very important, that is to address who are the drivers of biodiversity loss and climate change, that are huge companies, that are financial systems, that are truly creating activities that harm biodiversity or funding activities that harm biodiversity. These impacts now are not truly being accessed and included in decision-making process. We do have voluntary guidelines, but these voluntary guidelines are not enough. And when I say they are not enough, it's because they are not being accountable. You are providing tools, you are providing guidance, you are providing different approaches for companies and private sector to access their impacts. And so what we are doing with the results of this access of impacts, we do not communicate this to our communities, we do not communicate this to a general approach. So we do not know exactly, and we need to improve addressing regulation, multi-sectoral approach, multi-sectoral regulation, and even dialogues between our national jurisdiction and international. And the second thing we also heard a lot, that is creating fund opportunities, funding strategies, financial solutions that are truly putting people and nature at the center. We are talking about funding local biodiversity actions, funding Mother Earth-centered actions, and funding, above all, Indigenous peoples and local communities' rights. Land tenure and human and Indigenous peoples' rights now are the most efficient, effective, and equitable way that we know to conserve nature. When you're not properly given attention, too much attention are still being paid for market-based approaches when we are comparing to non-market-based approaches. And these non-market-based approaches that are the true solution that we know. If we go to the policy perspective and try to understand it, we still do not have one financial instrument or a facility that was created and designed properly to fund local biodiversity actions. And we do not have time to reform our institutions. So when you are thinking how we're going to fund local biodiversity actions, we still have a broken systems. We do not know how to make international flows go to the ground, go to the grassroots, and guarantee that those that are in the front line are keeping their sustainable livelihoods. We are not only talking about creating products and creating services, but we are talking about safeguards those who already have a living in harmony perspective. And this is one of the main perspectives that we need to start in creating financial solutions that are able to create this movement together. So thank you very much.
So we are nearing the end of our closing plenary, and I think we had a lot of amazing ideas and ingredients that are part of this roadmap. Before we get to the drawing, I'm going to ask the audience some questions, and it's your turn now to give some ingredients to the roadmap. So if we could get the Slido questions up. The first one is, in your opinion, what specific priority areas should be included in a roadmap for financing biodiversity? So now it's your time to give some ideas that can be put in the beautiful drawing that we're creating. So please grab your cell phones, scan the QR code, and give us some of your opinions and ideas. And I'm sure these ideas and opinions are going to be broadcasted here on the screen. Everyone gets their cell phones out and scanning. So can we get some answers up? Well, if it's not working, then we will have to go to the drawing. Okay, we're working. Get those answers up so we can see what your guys' opinion is for priority areas that we need to include in our roadmap. I have 12 participants typing. Yes, including Indigenous voices, thematic bonds, inclusivity, integrated landscape management, move away from a growth-focused economy, yes, towards a degrowth, I'm into that too. Innovative tools that benefit communities, human rights-based approaches, Actions to increase awareness of nature dependency, I'm also a fan of that. Integration of biodiversity and climate, I agree. Better ecosystem services valuations with Indigenous communities, also amazing. Radical transformative change, capitalism is not working for the people. South-South fundraising, these are great. You guys are excited for the end of the day. Here. Investing in mangroves, transparency, empowerment of rural and Indigenous women, restorative justice, transparency, amazing. So I think we have even a second Slido question. So the second question is around which specific approaches do you believe are essential for balancing the needs of local communities and biodiversity goals in our financing roadmap? So how can we really hear the needs of the local communities and integrate their needs into these financing mechanisms? Local ownership, inclusivity, financial education, that's a great one. Consultation. Listening and elevating the voices of the systemically oppressed and silenced. Putting the role of Indigenous peoples and local communities first. Listening and receiving. Co-creation, art, storytelling. That's a great one. We need more art, and the power of storytelling is very, very powerful. Transparency, custody agreements, locally led business models. We got a smart crowd here. I mean, I think we can make this happen with everyone here in the room. I'm feeling it. So I'd say we give ourselves a round of applause. So before we end, these are amazing responses, and they're going to be captured and synthesized into a report that's going to come out about the roadmap. But before we end, I would like to look at the beautiful painting, the live drawing that was made that captures all of the ideas that was shared here. So let's get the live drawing up, please. Dun, 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 dun. Wow. I mean, that is an amazing skill to have. I don't know, wow. Anna, you are amazing. That is so beautiful, and a clear representation of what we talked about. So I'm sure that we will be able to get this painting. It'll be posted probably on some website. So yeah, this was an exciting plenary, and I'd love to thank everyone, thank the panelists for joining us today. Thank you for being here so late in the day. I'm sure everyone's exhausted, but it's been an inspiring day, and I'm really pleased to invite John Colmy, the Managing Director of the GLF, to the stage for his closing remarks. And afterwards, please join us for an evening reception with music and food as we celebrate the day's achievements. Thank you so much.
I'm going to try to move through quickly some key points and also some thinking of GLF. And number one, I mean, we're moving into a period of unpredictability that we haven't seen in 12,000 years. That really is how bad it is. Things are going to change very, very, very fast. Planting a forest for 30 years is going to be more difficult. Planting a farm or a farm area for 10 years is going to be more difficult. To meet these challenges, we're going to have to rediscover, and I think the minister said today when we were talking, we have to rediscover, and I really believe this, the spirit and aspirations and intentions of Rio 92. We have to bring the conventions together. We've moved off into separate places, and none of them are working as well as they could. So we have to bring them all together, and that includes the migratory species, which is kind of the canary in the coal mine. We have to bring biodiversity as part of that into the core of financial investments. They've been outside for a long time. It's been focused on climate. We need to bring them into the financial instruments. We have to give urgent attention to existing domestic funding mechanisms, like conservation funds, but there's many, many funds in every country. I think Brazil has at least 8 different funds. These are up and working. And then that looks at then even, look at the indigenous, locally managed funds that are coming up. Those are very, very important, and we should be moving to help and build those and fund those as fast as we can. We hear there's a lack of bankable projects. I think we heard 2 great ones today. And they're out there, and they're in the South, and I don't know why people are saying we can't find them. Every month on GLF website, under the Luxembourg website partnership, we launch and we give 1 bankable project. We're going to give more and more. It's imperative that we get these out in front of bankers as fast as we can. They're there. They're in Africa. They're in Asia. They're in Latin America. They're everywhere. And there's amazing new tools. And that's going to help us with the speed and the way we look at and the way we adapt to these fast changes. Biomonitoring, and AI, of course. I mean, AI is phenomenal, what it's going to be able to do. I mean, we'll be able to predict where a flood's going to be, in theory, or where a next extinction will be, or, you know, where the fires will come next. It's going to be phenomenal. On the other hand, if it's unregulated, which is where it's heading right now, it can disrupt cultural institutions, and it can lead to a whole series of problems. So we've launched the GLF AI Hub for exactly this reason. We had 8 experts today. We had them in Africa. We're going to link AI experts across the South. We'll bring the North, but we're bringing them from the South, so they can help us seize the opportunities and protect against what a lot of people are calling what could be colonial digital colonialism. Think of Elon Musk and these kinds of guys. And what most important, if we're going to go invest in lands anywhere, we have to listen to, work with, and pay attention to the people we're investing in. We're going to have to work with the local communities and let them lead, not just go and sort of say, oh, tell us, let them lead on these investments. Then we'll be able to break through new ground. And we take it very seriously at GLF, and you've heard that today. We have these chapters now. We have over 50 locally managed, locally owned chapters and restoration steward programs, research programs, all over the world. They're led by communities, and they also are here. I hope some of you met. We have at least 8 of them today from around Latin America. They bring us the voice from the ground, and they are amazing people. And they're just incredible. They bring into GLF. They're at all of our conferences. They speak at all our conferences next to the ministers, and they're doing incredible things. They all have nurseries. They're all doing agroforestry. They're working all kinds of great things they're doing. Mangroves and wetlands and agroforestry and repairing and restorations. And they're amazing people. One of ours today, this week, will be announced. Jezebel Calderon will win the Midori $100,000 prize, the restoration steward working on mountains. Really fantastic. Now I have to get to the list of thank yous. This wouldn't have happened without the Ministry of Environment. Boy, that's difficult. The Ministry of Environment of Luxembourg. They've been a great partner. They've done the investment case and sponsored us for 4 years now. They're a great partner, and they really, really are serious about trying to break through. If we can just get a few bankable projects through, we can change this game. I also want to thank GLF's donors and partners and sponsors. There's a lot of them. The Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, BMZ, who is, and Secretary Flashbart, I always want to thank him personally. He's sort of the patron of GLF. German Ministry of Environment, Nature, Conservation, Nuclear Safety, Consumer Protection, BMUV, great. They're our 2 largest donors, ICI. 1 second, and some cool stuff coming. Okay. Also, the food systems land use restoration impact. It's the largest program on building sustainable value chains in the world right now. 28 major commodities, basically all the ones that plowed down the forest. Global Environment Facility, the GEF, which is also a charter member, the Robert Bosch Foundation, Arcadia Fund, very generously brought our chapters here, and the International Model Forest Network of Canada. Thank you to the 35 charter members and our engaged partners. Thank you particularly for the 91 session hosts we had today, 86 speakers from all over the world, and once again, for 10 years, 50% women. This is a big deal. And as a result, we had 2,000 participants and 600 here. 53% of our participants were women. This is how we change the world. Today we've reached over 15 million people online. You didn't realize it, but it's just going all over. And what's really cool is 500,000 people around the world, 104 countries, engage with the material today. That's not the reach, that's engaging in this. So that's pretty exciting. We're excited to share the outcomes of today's discussions will be presented at the Jeff Pavilion tomorrow at 11 o'clock. And some of the speakers today will join us to discuss the roadmap for financing. I don't know if they'll be able to do one as nice as this. It'll be more mechanical and more mathematical, but this is really, really special. I've never seen it done so well. We invite you to take part in this conversation, this roadmap, which is going to continue to next year in Brazil. Next year at the COP, we've already got our venue. It'll be one of the biggest GLFs we've ever done. We have to change. It has to begin in Brazil. We got 5 or 6 years. As we leave today, let's commit to transforming these ideas into impactful steps. That's kind of boring. Let's go change the world. That's what we have to do. If not us, who? If not now, when? Thank you.